What do you want? A mace or a sword? Come on, you need to make your mind. Say hello. Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we are talking about the difference between swords and maces. Also, if you like knights in shining armor, video game evaluations, but also ancient Rome, Greeks, Japanese, samurai, if you like all of these things, remember to subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron and click the notification bell to never miss an upload. So, generally speaking, whenever I play video games, whether it be, Morrowind, Skyrim, Oblivion, I always choose swords because I just like them more. But lately, I've decided to start trying maces out, and I've got to say, I fell in love with using maces. Now, obviously, we're talking about video games, so we're not aiming at perfect realism. It's a fantasy world. But some things that happen with maces and swords in the Elder Scrolls series sometimes are really right out bizarre. To show you exactly what I mean by that, we're going to look at damage, range and speed of swords and maces in all three games. For example, in Oblivion, the actual damage you will deal, it's a formula derived from the base damage of the weapon, modified by your character's weapon skill with that specific weapon, your character's strength in the case of maces and swords, but also the weapon's current health. In Skyrim, the situation is slightly different. The damage is derived by the base damage of the weapon, your character's weapon skill, and relevant skill perks. Also in Skyrim, you can increase the base damage of weapons using smithing. Morrowind, as you probably know, is the most RPG-like of all the three, and there were three basic kinds of attacks that you could perform with any weapon you had. You could chop, you could slash, you could thrust. Now, regardless of what kind of attack you would have chosen, which would already alter the kind of base damage, the calculations would be as follows. Weapon damage plus strength modifier plus condition modifier. The damage range in Morrowind is not representing a dice roll, but the range is there to describe how much damage you would deal if the button is pushed quickly or if you hold it and charge. Now, for the purposes of this video, we're going to compare the iron and steel version of swords and maces in all three games. Now, in Oblivion, an iron sword would have a base damage of 10 and a steel sword would have a basic damage of 12. An iron mace would have a base damage of 10, a steel mace would have a base damage of 12. So in terms of base damage, whether you use a longsword or whether you use a mace, there will be absolutely zero difference. In Skyrim, an iron sword has a base damage of 7, a steel sword has a base damage of 8. Compared it to the maces, we see a big difference. In Skyrim, an iron mace has a damage of 9, a steel mace has a damage of 10. So you can already see right off the bat, maces deal more damage in the Elder Scrolls Skyrim than they do in Oblivion. In Morrowind, this is their respective damage into chop, slash and thrust that a iron longsword and a steel longsword would deal. Now compare that with an iron mace and a steel mace. Now as you can see already, in terms of just raw basic damage, see how different the situation is already. In Morrowind, swords deal more damage than maces. In Oblivion, they deal the exact same amount of damage. In Skyrim, maces deal more damage than swords. Reach is where things get really weird, so I'd like to address reach first and then speed. Now, of course, you would imagine that a mace would be penalized in terms of reach if compared to a longsword, because obviously a mace is a lot smaller than a longsword. But does that actually happen? Well, let's have a look. In Oblivion, an iron longsword and a steel longsword both have a reach of 1.0. Iron mace and steel mace also have a reach of 1.0. That is very illogical. And even though the actual 3D weapons look very different in terms of length, the game's hitbox is at the same distance from the body of the person who is using it, 1.0. So Oblivion, no difference in reach. In Skyrim, one-handed swords have a reach of 1, maces have a reach of 1. Absolute no difference in reach. While in Morrowind, an iron longsword has a reach of 1.0, a steel longsword also has a reach of 1.0, iron mace 1.0, steel mace 1.0. So in the Elder Scrolls, Morrowind, Oblivion and Skyrim, reach is absolutely the same. So what about speed? So in Oblivion, an iron longsword has a speed of 1.0 and so does the steel longsword. All maces have a speed of 0.9. So in Oblivion, this is kind of strange because reach is not a defining factor. Damage is not a defining factor. So far the only difference we have between maces and swords is the swords have a higher DPS. Because assuming the same character with the same amount of stamina, swinging either a mace or a sword, if it hits the exact same amount of times as it does with the other weapon, he will deal more damage in the long run with the sword simply because it has a higher DPS. You have higher speed. So in Skyrim the difference is higher and it's actually more balanced. You choose a mace if you want each hit you place to count. But if you're confident in the amount of hits that you are going to be able to place, then the higher DPS will be with swords, even though the base raw damage is lower, because in the long run, if you place the same amount of hits, you will have a higher DPS with swords. You will deal more damage. So since reach, again, as we said, is not the defining factor, this gives a little bit of strategy into the game. But what about Morrowind? In Morrowind, an iron longsword and a steel longsword have the exact same speed at 1.35. Compare that to the speed of maces. Iron mace, steel mace, 1.3. So again, maces are slower, and in Morrowind this is more of a problem because so far all the advantages go towards the longsword. There's absolutely no reason for you in Morrowind to pick up a mace instead of a sword. Okay, all of this was impressive, but one thing that I really like about the Elder Scrolls Skyrim, which is where I think maces are treated with a bit more respect than they are in obviously Morrowind and in Oblivion too, is the fact that you've got perks, as I said. Perks are great because they do make maces more useful strategically, even from a gameplay point of view. So skills with weapons work differently in Morrowind, Oblivion and Skyrim, and Morrowind being the most complex. The reason being that Morrowind had more weapon types. You even had spears, you had many different kinds of weapons, and each weapon had its own skill. So you have short sword skill, you have long sword skill. In Oblivion this becomes just your skill with blades. So if you're good with blades, you're good with short blades, you're good with long blades, and it actually kind of makes more sense. More on that later. Now in Skyrim the situation becomes even more simple. You have just one-handed and two-handed, and within one-handed you've got axes, you've got swords, and you've got maces, so blunt and edged implements, whereas in Oblivion, for example, if you keep using a mace, you will only increase your ability with blunt weapons. In Skyrim, whether you use a sword or whether you use a mace, it will increase your ability with one-handed weapons anyways. Now that's neat, because the way Skyrim differentiates is the perks, and I think that that's a lot better. If you want to specialize with one weapon instead of the other, then you need to spend those points that you gain as you level up using one-handed weapons and focus on either blades, axes or maces. The perk that has to do with sword is called Bladesman and increases the percentage of chance of doing critical damage. The perk that has to do with axes is called Hack and Slash, and it causes axes to deal extra bleeding damage. The perk that has to do with maces is called Bone Breaker, and it increases the amount of percentage of armor that gets ignored by your blunt weapons, so your maces and your warhammers. They really become anti-armor weapons. Now to me that's actually really good, because you see, in reality, if you know how to swing a sword, the moment you pick up a mace, or an axe for that matter, but the moment you pick up a mace, you don't automatically just forget everything you've learned about combat with a sword just because it's a different weapon. Given the point of balance is different, this one is a top heavy weapon and therefore it's going to be less nimble than a sword is, but much that has to do with combat has to do with your own skill. How agile you are, your muscle memory, how quick your reflexes are, your ability to parry, how technical you are, your ability of judging tempos, so the amount of things that you can actually do realistically to your opponent before he retaliates, your state of mind during combat. All of these things remain. So in my opinion, for a RPG or a video game to be realistic in terms of combat with weapons, it is good that you have one skill, like in the case of Skyrim, one-handed, you are used to fight with these weapons, and your ability transmits at least partially to all weapons that are relatively similar. But then, like Skyrim does with perks, you can actually specialize and become more effective with a weapon that you train the most. And that's why, for example, a system such as that in Oblivion, and even worse in Morrowind, where you're excellent with a short sword, but you become a complete noob when you take a sword in your hand that is a bit longer. It just makes no sense, given your ability to judge reach will be slightly impeached. Or if you are a person who thrusts a lot, of course you can't thrust very much with a mace, so you will lose something, but you won't lose everything. Some of your skills should carry over. But apart from that, I like Skyrim because it makes these useful against someone who's wearing armor, and I think it makes a lot of sense, because a mace is a blunt implement. Now, given this replica that I have, although it's very beautiful, the flanges are actually quite thin. The original would have had thicker flanges, and that is because mostly these are not meant to poke into a person, these are not meant to spike a person, but these are meant to bite into a person who's wearing mail, and even plate up to a certain extent, although of course it's a lot harder to hurt someone in plate. even with this, but if someone is wearing mail or it has a helmet, you don't want your weapon to glance off, which is what would happen with a sword, for example, and what would happen if this was just a round circle. It has these flanges in this case, or spikes in the case of Morning Stars, for example, so that the weapon bites and transfers as much percussive energy as possible, concentrated into a small area. This is why these weapons are actually more effective to deal damage even if someone is wearing armor. And that's why I think that the Elder Scrolls Skyrim is doing a better job than any other of the Elder Scrolls series at making maces great again. As we just said on this video, using maces in Morrowind absolutely pointless. Using maces in Oblivion, it does give you a little bit of choice, but it is in Skyrim that the situation becomes more realistic. This becomes a weapon that can deal damage through armor regardless of the armor. So if it makes sense, and it makes the game more enjoyable, because depending on who you're fighting with, if you see that your opponent has got a lot of armor, you might want to switch to your mace, whereas if you notice that your opponent doesn't have much armor, then you might want to use your sword, because it will have a higher DPS and it's going to be quicker and more nimble to use, which is very similar to how things are in reality. A sword would be more nimble. So to conclude, I think that Skyrim takes the cake in terms of the game that does more justice out of the Elder Scrolls series to the mace and its effectiveness, followed by Oblivion, which at least gives a little tiny bit of difference strategically speaking, but still doesn't really do much justice, and there isn't much reason why to use a mace. And the worst one in this case is Morrowind. Although Morrowind is an excellent game, I'd like to underline, the combat in Morrowind feels a lot more like an RPG, and so for those people who come from D&D, Morrowind is probably going to be the best game out of the three. But still, in the Elder Scrolls Morrowind, there is absolutely no reason to pick one of these and use it instead of a sword. Alright, Noble Ones, well, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember the thumbs up, and remember that if you're not yet members of this community, become a Noble One and subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. And remember that the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.